The air was thick with the scent of ash and molten metal, a choking haze that turned the battlefield into a blurred nightmare. Kale, the lone survivor of his squad, crouched behind the shattered remains of a wall, his hands gripping his pulse rifle so tightly that his knuckles turned white beneath his armor. The sound of distant explosions echoed in his ears, punctuated by the guttural roars of the enemy, beasts that defied comprehension. Kale wasn't just any soldier. He was a member of the Vanguard, Earth's elite military force trained to combat the Zethari, an alien race that had descended upon humanity without warning decades ago. But this mission was different. This wasn't a battle for territory or resources. This was a mission to retrieve the catalyst, an ancient artifact said to hold the power to turn the tide of the war. Only Kale wasn't sure it even existed. The Vanguard had sent a team of 20 to recover the catalyst, deep within Zethari-occupied territory. Their mission was simple on paper. Infiltrate the ruins of Halvaris Prime, locate the artifact, and extract it before the Zethari knew they were there. But the Vanguard hadn't anticipated the traps, the ambushes, or the sheer ferocity of the Zethari forces. One by one, Kale had watched his squad fall. The medic, Jennys, was the first, torn apart by a Zethari hunter. Then Leon, the demolition expert, vaporized in an energy blast that left nothing but the faint scent of ozone. By the time they reached the ruins, only Kale and Captain Reese remained. "Don't stop moving," Reese had barked as they dashed through the crumbling corridors of the ancient city. The walls were lined with alien hieroglyphs that seemed to glow faintly, pulsing in rhythm with an unseen heartbeat. "The catalyst is close. I can feel it," but the Zethari were relentless. When the ambush came, Reese shoved Kale out of the line of fire and turned to face their attackers, plasma grenades in hand. "Go!" he shouted, his voice drowned out by the roar of explosions as he made his final stand. Now Kale was alone. The ruins were a labyrinth of corridors and chambers, each more foreboding than the last. The glyphs on the walls seemed to shift as Kale passed them, their meanings just out of reach, as if mocking him. His HUD flickered sporadically, the interference from the Zethari technology scrambling his systems. He was running low on ammo, his armor was cracked, and his body ached from a dozen injuries. But he couldn't stop. Not now. As he descended deeper into the ruins, the air grew colder. The oppressive heat of the battlefield above gave way to an eerie chill, and Kale's breath formed faint clouds in the dim light. He could feel it now, an energy unlike anything he'd ever encountered. It was drawing him forward, pulling him toward something vast and incomprehensible. And then he saw it. The catalyst stood at the center of a massive chamber, suspended in a beam of pale blue light. It wasn't a weapon as Kale had imagined. It was a sphere, perfectly smooth and blacker than the void, as if it absorbed all the light around it. The glyphs on the walls glowed brighter here, their patterns converging toward the artifact. Kale hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. The catalyst pulsed faintly, and with each pulse, he felt something probing at the edges of his mind, like fingers brushing against his thoughts. It wasn't just an artifact. It was alive. As he stepped closer, a voice echoed in his head, soft, alien, and incomprehensible. The glyphs on the walls began to move, swirling like living things, and Kale realized with a jolt of fear that they were forming shapes. Faces. Hundreds of faces, human and alien, their expressions locked in eternal agony. "Kale," the voice became clearer, forming words he could understand. "You seek to save them. But are you willing to pay the price?" Before Kale could answer, the chamber shook violently. He spun around, his rifle raised, as a massive figure emerged from the shadows. It was a Zethari warlord, its towering frame clad in jagged black armor that shimmered like oil. Its glowing blue eyes locked onto Kale, and it let out a roar that reverberated through the chamber. Kale opened fire, his shots barely scratching the warlord's armor. The creature lunged, its massive claws swiping at him with blinding speed. Kale dove to the side, his pulse rifle clattering to the ground as the warlord's attack shattered the floor where he'd been standing. He scrambled for his sidearm, firing off shots as he backed toward the catalyst. The warlord snarled, its movements relentless, but Kale noticed something strange. Each time he neared the catalyst, the creature hesitated, its roars growing softer, almost pained. Realizing his only chance, Kale turned and sprinted toward the artifact. The light around it pulsed violently, the glyphs on the walls flashing in rapid succession. The voice returned, louder this time, almost desperate. "You will not leave unchanged?" Kale reached out, his hand trembling, and touched the surface of the catalyst. The moment his fingers made contact, a surge of energy shot through him, burning through his veins like fire. Kale screamed as visions flooded his mind. Memories that weren't his, of worlds consumed by war, of civilizations rising and falling, of the Zethri themselves, once noble, now twisted by their hunger for power. And then he saw it. The truth. The catalyst wasn't just an artifact. It was a prison. Inside it was a being of unimaginable power, a creature the Zethri had worshipped as a god before it turned on them. They had sealed it away, but not before it had left its mark on their race, corrupting them into the monsters they were now. The energy from the catalyst coursed through Kale, reshaping him, fusing him with its power. The warlord roared again, but this time Kale didn't flinch. He turned to face the creature, his eyes glowing with the same pale blue light as the catalyst. The warlord charged, but Kale raised a hand, and with a thought, the creature froze mid-step. The energy of the catalyst flowed through him, and with a single gesture, the warlord dissolved into ash. When Kale emerged from the ruins, the battlefield above was silent. The Zethri forces were gone, retreating as if sensing the shift in power. Kale looked down at his hands, the faint glow of the catalyst's energy still pulsing beneath his skin. He was no longer just a soldier. He was something else entirely, something more. The Vanguard would call him a hero, the man who saved humanity. But Kale knew the truth. The catalyst hadn't given him its power out of generosity. It had chosen him for a purpose, and that purpose was far from over. As he gazed at the war-torn horizon, Kale felt the voice in his mind again, quieter now but still present. The war is not won. You are the key. And so, Kale began his journey, not as a soldier but as a guardian of a power he barely understood, tasked with a mission that could either save the universe or doom it forever. Kale stood at the edge of the ruins, his mind still reeling from the transformation. The catalyst's voice was now a constant presence in his thoughts, faint yet insistent, whispering truths he couldn't fully comprehend. Every step he took felt heavier, as though he carried the weight of countless lives with him. The glow beneath his skin pulsed faintly, an ever-present reminder that he was no longer the man he had been. He began walking, unsure of where to go. The battlefield above had fallen silent, the Zethri retreating into the shadows, but Kale knew this wasn't victory. The catalyst's energy coursing through him had revealed something far more terrifying. The Zethri were pawns in a much larger game. The war humanity thought it was fighting was merely the prelude to something far greater, something ancient and unrelenting. As Kale made his way back to the Vanguard outpost, he noticed the world around him seemed different. The colors were sharper, the air heavier, and the faint hum of the catalyst's power echoed in everything. He could see threads of energy connecting the earth, the sky, and even himself, a web of life and power he'd never noticed before. It was beautiful, but it was also overwhelming. When he arrived at the outpost, the reaction was immediate. Soldiers scrambled to their feet, weapons drawn, their faces a mixture of awe and fear. Kale's glowing eyes and the faint aura of energy around him marked him as something otherworldly, something they didn't understand. "Stand down," he said, his voice carrying an authority he hadn't intended. The soldiers hesitated, then lowered their weapons, their movements uncertain. General Thorne, the Vanguard's commanding officer, stepped forward, his face hard but cautious. "Kale," he said, his voice steady. "What happened out there?" Kale hesitated. How could he explain? That the mission they'd sent him on had uncovered a truth so vast, so incomprehensible, it made the Zethri invasion seem trivial? That he was no longer entirely human? He decided to keep it simple. The catalyst, it's not just an artifact. It's alive. And now, it's a part of me. Thorne's expression darkened. A part of you? What does that mean? It means I can feel it, Kale replied. The energy, the power, but also the danger. The Zethri weren't just after the catalyst to win this war. They were trying to stop something worse. Something coming for all of us. The room fell silent. The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances and Thorne's jaw tightened. And what exactly is this something? Kale closed his eyes, the visions from the catalyst flashing through his mind, shattered worlds, burning skies, and an all-consuming darkness. I don't know its name, he said finally, but it's old. Older than the Zethri, older than our universe. The Zethri tried to seal it away, but their seal is breaking. And now it's coming. Thorne's skepticism was clear, but he didn't argue. Instead he nodded. If what you're saying is true, then we need to prepare. But first, we need to understand what we're dealing with. Kale nodded, though he knew there was little time for study. The catalyst had chosen him for a reason, and he could feel its urgency pressing against his thoughts. The seal was weakening, and the darkness was already reaching through. The days that followed were a blur of activity. Scientists from the Vanguard swarmed around Kale, analyzing his newfound abilities, studying the residual energy from the catalyst, and comparing it to what little they knew of Zethri technology. Kale endured it all with patience, but deep down he knew their efforts were in vain. The knowledge they sought wasn't something they could find in data or readings. It was buried deep within him, locked away by the catalyst, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. The first sign of the coming storm arrived 3 days later. It began with a tremor, faint at first but growing stronger with each passing minute. Alarms blared across the outpost as the ground cracked and split, releasing plumes of dark energy that shimmered like liquid shadows. Soldiers scrambled to contain the chaos, but the energy was alive, coiling and writhing as if searching for something. Kale stood at the center of the chaos, the catalyst's power surging within him. He could feel the darkness probing, testing the limits of his strength. It wasn't just an attack. It was a message. And then they appeared. The creatures that emerged from the fissures were unlike anything Kale had seen before. They were tall, skeletal beings with translucent skin that pulsed with dark energy. Their eyes burned with a cold, white fire, and their movements were unnaturally fluid, like shadows given form. The soldiers opened fire, but the creatures were unfazed, their bodies reforming as quickly as they were torn apart. Kale stepped forward, his hands glowing with the catalyst's light. The creatures paused, their eyeless faces turning toward him as if recognizing something familiar. "You're not welcome here," Kale said, his voice calm but firm. The largest of the creatures stepped forward, its form rippling like smoke. When it spoke, its voice was a deep, resonant echo. "Bearer of the catalyst," it said. "You are a fool to stand against the tide. The seal is breaking. Your efforts are futile." Kale didn't flinch. "Maybe. But I'm not going to let you destroy my world without a fight." The creature tilted its head as if amused. "This is not your fight, mortal. You are but a fragment of a larger game. The catalyst will not save you. It will consume you." Kale didn't respond. Instead, he raised his hand, the catalyst's energy blazing to life around him. The creatures roared in unison and charged, their forms shifting and twisting as they moved. The battle that followed was nothing short of cataclysmic. Kale fought with a ferocity he hadn't known he possessed, the catalyst's power flowing through him like an unstoppable river. Light clashed with shadow, each strike shaking the ground and sending shockwaves rippling through the air. The soldiers watched in awe and terror, their weapons useless against the onslaught. Finally, with a blinding surge of energy, Kale unleashed a wave of light that engulfed the creatures, reducing them to ash. The fissures sealed, the darkness retreating once more. When the dust settled, Kale stood alone at the center of the battlefield, his body trembling with exhaustion. The soldiers cheered, but Kale couldn't share their relief. He could still feel the darkness, lingering just beyond the edges of reality, waiting for its next opportunity. Thorn approached, his expression grim. "Is it over?" Kale shook his head. No. This was just the beginning. The catalyst pulsed within him, its energy a constant reminder of the burden he now carried. The seal was breaking and the darkness was coming. But Kale wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was the bearer of the catalyst, the last line of defense against an ancient and unimaginable threat. And he would fight no matter the cost. For his world, for his people, and for the hope that, somehow, they could survive the storm to come. Kale barely had time to recover before the next ripple of chaos swept across the world. The fissures that had appeared near the outpost were just the beginning. Reports flooded in from every corner of the planet. Strange energy surges, unnatural storms, and sightings of the shadowy creatures Kale had fought. It was as if the darkness was testing humanity's defenses, pushing further with each wave of destruction. The vanguard mobilized all their forces, spreading themselves thin as they tried to contain the outbreaks. Cities were evacuated, borders fortified, and the brightest minds in science and technology worked tirelessly to understand the phenomena. But Kale knew the truth. No army or technology would be enough to stop what was coming. The seal was failing, and every moment they delayed brought the darkness closer to breaching through completely. In the days that followed, Kale's connection to the catalyst grew stronger and stranger. He began to see flashes of events that hadn't happened yet, glimpses of a future filled with fire and ash. He could feel the presence of the darkness moving across the edges of reality, a vast and incomprehensible force that stretched across dimensions. But alongside the visions came something else. Memories? They weren't his, yet they felt real. He saw a civilization that had once thrived, their technology far beyond anything humanity could comprehend. He saw their struggle against the darkness, their desperate attempts to contain it, and their ultimate failure. These weren't the Zethri, This was a race even older, their name lost to time. They had created the catalyst as their last act, a weapon and a prison, entrusting it to the future in the hope that someone stronger would succeed where they had failed. Kale wasn't just the bearer of the catalyst. He was its final chance. Asha returned to the outpost, summoned by Thorn after he realized they needed her expertise. When she saw Kale, her breath caught in her throat. He looked different, not just the glow of his eyes or the faint aura of energy that surrounded him, but the way he carried himself. He was no longer just a soldier, he was something more. "Kale," she said softly, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and concern. "What's happening to you?" Kale turned to her, his expression unreadable. "I'm becoming what I need to be," he said. "And it scares me." Asha frowned. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then looked away. "The catalyst is changing me. It's giving me the power to fight the darkness, but I don't know how much of myself I'm losing in the process. I can feel it, Asha. Every time I use its energy, it takes a little more of me." Asha reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "We'll figure it out," she said firmly. "You're not in this alone." Kale looked at her, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. But deep down, he wasn't sure if even she could save him. The next attack came without warning. Kale was in the middle of a briefing with Thorn and Asha when the ground shook violently. The sky outside darkened as massive clouds of shadow rolled in, blotting out the sun. A low, guttural roar echoed across the outpost, sending a chill down Kale's spine. "They're here," he said, his voice low and grim. The soldiers scrambled into action, manning turrets and forming defensive lines. Kale stepped outside, his heart pounding as he saw the source of the roar. A massive rift had opened in the sky, and from it poured an army of shadowy creatures. They were larger, faster, and more coordinated than the ones he had fought before, their glowing eyes locked on the outpost. At the center of the rift was something new, a figure clad in black, its form humanoid but radiating a palpable aura of malice. It carried a massive blade that shimmered with dark energy, and its glowing white eyes fixed on Kale with an intensity that made his chest tighten. "The Harbinger," the catalyst whispered in Kale's mind. "A servant of the darkness. It has come to break the seal." Kale gritted his teeth and stepped forward, his hands glowing with the catalyst's energy. "Then let's make sure it fails." The battle was unlike anything Kale had faced before. The Harbinger's army was relentless, their attacks coordinated and devastating. The vanguard soldiers fought valiantly, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. Kale threw himself into the fray, the catalyst's power surging through him as he unleashed wave after wave of energy, cutting through the creatures like a blade of light. But the Harbinger was waiting for him. As Kale fought his way through the chaos, the Harbinger descended from the rift, its massive blade slicing through the air with a sound like thunder. Kale barely dodged the first strike, the force of the attack sending a shockwave through the ground. "You are not worthy of the catalyst's power," the Harbinger said, its voice a deep, resonant growl. "You are but a child playing with fire." Kale didn't respond. He lunged at the Harbinger, their weapons clashing in a blinding explosion of light and shadow. The force of their battle shook the outpost, the ground cracking beneath their feet as they traded blow after blow. For every strike Kale landed, the Harbinger countered with a precision and ferocity that left him breathless. But as the fight wore on, Kale began to notice something. The Harbinger was faltering. It wasn't immune to the catalyst's power. With a final surge of energy, Kale unleashed a devastating blast that sent the Harbinger crashing to the ground. But as he prepared to deliver the final blow, the creature laughed, a deep, chilling sound that made Kale hesitate. "You cannot stop it," the Harbinger said, its voice filled with dark amusement. "The seal is breaking. And when it does, all your power will mean nothing." With that, the Harbinger dissolved into shadow, its laughter echoing as it faded into the void. The battlefield fell silent, the remaining creatures retreating into the rift as it closed. The soldiers cheered, but Kale felt no victory. The Harbinger's words lingered in his mind, a grim reminder of the fight still to come. Asha approached him, her face pale but determined. "What now?" Kale looked up at the darkened sky, the catalyst pulsing faintly beneath his skin. "We find the seal," he said, "and we make sure it holds." But even as he spoke the words, he knew it wouldn't be enough. The darkness wasn't just trying to break through, it was trying to consume everything. And Kale was running out of time. The Vanguard's victory was short-lived. While the Harbinger was defeated and the rift had closed, the aftermath of the battle was devastating. The outpost lay in ruins, its walls shattered, and many of the soldiers who had fought alongside Kale now lay motionless on the battlefield. Survivors scrambled to rebuild and regroup, but the fear in their eyes was unmistakable. They had seen a glimpse of the darkness Kale had spoken of, and they knew it was only the beginning. Kale stood at the edge of the outpost, staring at the horizon. The catalyst within him pulsed erratically, feeding him fragmented visions of what lay ahead: endless war, collapsing worlds, and the final unraveling of reality itself. Each vision was more terrifying than the last, and with every passing moment, Kale felt the weight of his burden growing heavier. Asha found him there, her face pale and streaked with soot. She had been working tirelessly to analyze the residual energy left behind by the Harbinger and its army, searching for clues that might give them an edge in the fight to come. "Kale," she said softly, approaching him. "I've been going through the data we collected during the battle. There's something you need to see." In the makeshift command center, Asha displayed a series of holograms, each one showing energy readings from the Harbinger and the Rift. The patterns were chaotic, fluctuating wildly, but there was something unmistakably familiar about them. "This energy," Asha said, pointing to the largest spike on the graph, "it's tied to the catalyst. The Harbinger's power was directly connected to the seal. That's why it came here. It wasn't just trying to break the seal, it was trying to use you to do it." Kale frowned, his jaw tightening. "Use me? How?" "The catalyst is a key," Asha explained. "But it's also a lock. The darkness needs someone connected to it, someone like you, to weaken the seal from the inside. That's why the Harbinger fought you. It was testing your limits, trying to push you into using more of the catalyst's power. The more you use it, the weaker the seal becomes." Kale felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "So every time I fight, every time I use this power, I'm bringing the darkness closer?" Asha nodded, her expression grim. "That's what it looks like." Kale turned away, his hands curling into fists. He had thought the catalyst was his weapon, his greatest asset in the fight against the darkness. But now it seemed like it might also be his undoing. That night, Kale sat alone in the ruins of the outpost, staring at the stars. The catalyst was quiet now, its whispers subdued, but he could still feel its presence, a constant hum at the edge of his thoughts. He thought about his squad, the people he had lost, and the sacrifices that had been made to get him this far. He thought about the Harbinger's final words, the warning it had left behind. And he thought about Asha. She had risked everything to help him, to uncover the truth about the catalyst and the darkness it held at bay. He couldn't let her down. He couldn't let humanity down. As he sat there, a faint glow appeared in the distance, just over the horizon. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but it grew brighter with each passing second. Kale stood, his pulse quickening. This wasn't the glow of the catalyst, it was something else, something new. The ground trembled beneath his feet, and a low, resonant hum filled the air. Kale grabbed his rifle and sprinted toward the source of the light, his heart pounding. Whatever was coming, he needed to face it head-on. What Kale found at the source of the glow stopped him in his tracks. A massive structure had risen from the earth, its surface covered in the same shifting glyphs that adorned the catalyst. It pulsed with a rhythmic energy, its light casting long shadows across the surrounding terrain. Asha and Thorn arrived moments later, both breathless and wide-eyed. "What is that?" Thorn asked, his voice tinged with awe and fear. "It's another part of the seal," Asha said, her eyes fixed on the structure. "Or maybe the seal itself, manifesting. It's reacting to the catalyst?" Kale approached the structure cautiously, his hand instinctively reaching for the glowing shard embedded in his chest. As he got closer, the glyphs on the structure began to shift, forming patterns that seemed to beckon him forward. "This is what it wants," Kale said, his voice low. "It's drawing me to it." Asha grabbed his arm, her grip firm. "You don't have to do this, Kale. We can find another way." Kale turned to her, his expression resolute. "There is no other way. If the darkness is going to break through, I need to face it now. This might be our only chance to stop it." Before Asha could protest, Kale stepped into the glow of the structure. The light engulfed him, and in an instant he was gone. Kale found himself in a place that defied description. It was neither light nor dark, neither solid nor void. The air shimmered with energy, and the ground beneath him seemed to shift and ripple with every step he took. At the center of this strange realm stood a towering figure, its form wreathed in shadow and flame. "You have come," the figure said, its voice resonating through the space like a thunderclap. "The bearer of the catalyst, the one chosen to end the cycle." Kale raised his rifle, his jaw set. "I didn't come here to talk. If you're the one behind this, then let's finish it." The figure laughed, a deep, echoing sound that sent chills down Kale's spine. "You misunderstand, mortal. I'm not your enemy. I am the cycle itself, the balance that must be maintained. The seal was never meant to last forever. It is breaking because that is its purpose. Kale lowered his rifle slightly, confusion flickering across his face. What are you talking about? The darkness you fight is not an invader, the figure said. It is a part of the universe as essential as the light. The seal was created not to destroy it, but to contain it, to give balance a chance to endure. But balance cannot be forced. It must be earned. Kale took a step forward, his fists clenched. So what am I supposed to do? Just let the darkness consume everything? No, the figure said. You must choose. The catalyst holds the power to reshape the seal, to create a new balance. But in doing so, it will consume you. Are you willing to sacrifice yourself to save a world that may never truly understand your choice? Kale stared at the figure, his mind racing. He thought of Asha, of Thorn, of the soldiers and civilians who were counting on him. He thought of the worlds he had seen in his visions, the countless lives destroyed by the darkness. And he made his choice. Kale raised the catalyst, its light blazing brighter than ever before. The figure watched silently as Kale channeled its energy, his body trembling with the effort. The seal began to reform, its fractured pieces knitting back together, stronger than before. As the light consumed him, Kale felt a profound sense of peace. The darkness receded, its tendrils retreating into the void, and the balance was restored. The universe would endure at least for now. When the light faded, Kale was gone. The seal stood whole once more, a testament to his sacrifice. Back at the outpost, Asha stared at the horizon, tears streaming down her face. She could feel the change, the quieting of the chaos, the stillness that followed Kale's final act. She knew he was gone, but his presence lingered, a faint glow that would never truly fade. He did it, Thorn said quietly, standing beside her. Asha nodded, her voice breaking. He gave us a future. And as the stars shone brighter in the night sky, the world began to heal, carrying the memory of the soldier who had given everything to save it years past after Kale's sacrifice, and the world began to rebuild. The Vanguard became more than just a military force. It evolved into a coalition of humanity's brightest minds, dedicated to understanding the energy of the seal and preparing for future threats. The seal itself became a symbol of hope, a testament to Kale's courage and the power of unity against insurmountable odds. But for Asha, the loss of Kale was a wound that never fully healed. She had watched him transform, watched him fight battles no one else could comprehend, and ultimately, she had watched him disappear into the light of the seal. She often found herself gazing at the horizon, wondering if he was truly gone, or if some part of him still existed, tied to the seal and the balance he had fought so hard to protect. It wasn't until a decade after Kale's sacrifice that the first anomaly appeared. A small team of researchers stationed near the seal detected a faint pulse of energy, one that matched Kale's unique signature. At first, they dismissed it as interference, a lingering echo of the battle that had reforged the seal. But when the pulses became more frequent and more distinct, Asha knew she couldn't ignore it. The Vanguard assembled a team, led by Asha herself, to investigate. Equipped with advanced technology and knowledge gleaned from years of studying the seal, they ventured into the ruins where the seal was anchored. The glyphs on its surface glowed faintly as they approached, the patterns shifting in ways they had never seen before. "It's like it's reacting to us," one of the researchers said, their voice tinged with awe. Asha didn't respond. She stepped closer, her heart pounding as she placed her hand against the surface of the seal. The moment her skin made contact, a surge of energy flowed through her, and she gasped as visions filled her mind. She saw Kale, his form wreathed in light, his eyes glowing with the energy of the catalyst. He stood in the in-between, the space beyond reality, his gaze fixed on her. "Asha," his voice echoed in her mind, faint but unmistakable. "I don't have much time. The balance is holding, but something is shifting. Something bigger." Her breath caught in her throat. "Kale? Is it really you?" "It's me," he said, his voice steady. "The catalyst binds me to the seal, but the balance isn't perfect. The darkness is adapting, and the seal won't hold it forever. You need to prepare." The vision began to fade, but before it disappeared completely, Kale's expression softened. "You were right," he said quietly. "I wasn't alone. I never was." And then he was gone. When Asha awoke, she found herself surrounded by concerned faces. The researchers had pulled her away from the seal after she collapsed, and she could feel the lingering warmth of its energy in her veins. "He's alive," she said, her voice trembling. "Or, part of him is. He's tied to the seal." Thorn, now retired but still a trusted advisor, listened intently as Asha recounted what she had seen. If Kale says the balance is shifting, we have to take it seriously, he said. What do we do? Asha straightened, her resolve hardening. We keep preparing. We study the seal, strengthen it, and learn everything we can about the darkness. And we make sure that when it comes back, we're ready. Over the next few years, Asha and her team made groundbreaking discoveries about the seal and its connection to the universe. They uncovered ancient records buried deep within the ruins, left behind by the civilization that had first created the catalyst. These records spoke of a cycle, a natural ebb and flow of light and darkness that spanned millennia. The seal wasn't meant to stop the darkness forever, it was meant to buy time for those who could stand against it. Humanity's efforts shifted from mere survival to preparation. The vanguard became a beacon of hope, uniting the world in a common cause. Cities rebuilt with technologies derived from the catalyst's energy, creating a new era of prosperity and innovation. But beneath the surface, there was always the quiet understanding that the darkness would return. Decades turned into centuries and Kale's story became legend. His name was etched into monuments, his sacrifice taught in every school, his image immortalized in art and literature. But for those who truly understood the seal, he was more than a hero, he was a reminder that the fight was never truly over. Asha, now in her twilight years, often visited the seal. She would sit in its shadow, her thoughts drifting to the man who had changed everything. Though she had lived a long and fulfilling life, a part of her had always remained with Kale, tied to the promise he had made and the burden he had carried. One evening, as the sun set over the horizon, she felt the faintest pulse of energy beneath her feet. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but she recognized it immediately. Tears filled her eyes as she placed her hand against the seal, the glyphs glowing faintly beneath her touch. "I'm still here," she whispered. "We're still fighting." And somewhere beyond the veil of reality, Kale Grayson stood watch, his presence eternal, his mission unending. The darkness would come again, but so would the light. And together they would endure. Centuries passed, and humanity thrived under the protection of the seal. The discoveries made by Asha and her successors had ushered in a golden age of unity and innovation. Entire cities floated in the skies, powered by the faint remnants of energy derived from the catalyst. Space exploration reached distant stars, and humanity began to colonize new worlds. The story of Kale Grayson, the man who became one with the catalyst to save the universe, became a tale whispered across generations. Part history, part myth. But deep beneath the surface of this prosperity, the seal pulsed faintly, a quiet heartbeat that reminded those who understood its purpose that the battle was never truly over. The world changed, but the seal remained. It stood in the ruins of the ancient battleground, untouched by time, its glowing glyphs a silent testament to Kale's sacrifice. Over the centuries, the vanguard evolved into the guardians of the balance, a secretive order sworn to protect the seal and ensure its stability. They trained their brightest minds and most skilled fighters, always prepared for the day when the darkness would return. Among the new guardians was a young woman named Lyra. Fiercely intelligent and driven, she had spent her entire life studying the legends of Kale Grayson and the Catalyst. She often found herself drawn to the seal, feeling a strange connection to its energy that no one could explain. Though she had never seen Kale or heard his voice, she felt his presence in the same way others felt the warmth of the sun. One evening, while standing alone before the seal, Lyra placed her hand against its surface. To her surprise, the glyphs shifted beneath her touch, forming patterns she had never seen before. A pulse of energy flowed through her, and for the briefest moment, she saw a vision. It was Kale. He stood in a realm of endless light and shadow, his form wreathed in energy, his eyes glowing with the same pale blue light as the catalyst. He looked at her, his expression calm but serious. "Lyra," he said, his voice echoing in her mind. "The cycle is nearing its end. The balance is tipping. The darkness is rising again." Lyra's breath caught in her throat. "What can we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "How do we stop it?" Kale's gaze softened. "You must be ready. The seal is strong, but it cannot hold forever. The catalyst chose me to be its guardian, but it also chose you. You carry its legacy. You are the bridge between light and shadow." Before Lyra could ask what he meant, the vision faded, and she was left standing alone before the seal. Her heart raced as she tried to process what she had seen. Kale's words were clear. The darkness was returning, and it was her turn to stand against it. The Guardians wasted no time. Under Lyra's leadership, they began preparing for the coming storm. Ancient texts and records left behind by Asha were studied with renewed urgency, and new technologies were developed to strengthen humanity's defenses. Lyra trained tirelessly, honing her skills and deepening her connection to the seal. Though she carried the weight of Kale's legacy, she knew she couldn't face the darkness alone. The first signs of the cycle's end appeared in the far reaches of space. Explorers on the outer colonies reported strange anomalies, planets consumed by shadow, stars that flickered and vanished without explanation. The darkness was moving, its presence spreading across the galaxy like a stain. And then the rifts began to appear. The first rift opened near one of humanity's oldest colonies, unleashing an army of shadowy creatures unlike any seen before. They were faster, stronger, and more coordinated than the creatures Kale had faced centuries ago. The Guardians mobilized their forces, but the battle was brutal. For every creature they destroyed, two more seemed to take its place. Lyra led the charge, her connection to the seal giving her an edge in combat. She wielded a weapon crafted from fragments of the catalyst, its energy surging through her as she fought. But even with her strength, the tide of battle was overwhelming. As the Guardians began to fall back, Lyra felt the seal calling to her. She turned toward it, her heart pounding as she realized what needed to be done. "Hold the line," she shouted to her comrades. "I'll finish this." She sprinted toward the seal, her weapon glowing brighter with each step. The glyphs on its surface shifted and pulsed, and as she reached out to touch it, a wave of energy engulfed her. The world around her faded, and she found herself standing in the in-between, the realm of light and shadow where Kale resided. Kale was waiting for her. "You're ready," he said, his voice steady. "But this fight won't be like the ones before. The darkness has learned, and it won't stop until the seal is destroyed." Lyra nodded, her resolve unshaken. "Tell me what I need to do." Kale stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder. "The seal was built to contain the darkness, but it can also channel its energy. You'll need to use that power to turn it against itself. But be warned, the more you draw on the darkness, the closer you'll come to becoming one with it." "I'll do whatever it takes," Lyra said firmly. "Just tell me how to save them." Kale's expression softened. "You remind me of her, of Asha. She believed in me even when I doubted myself. Now I'll believe in you." He raised his hand, and the energy of the catalyst flowed into Lyra, filling her with a power unlike anything she had ever felt. The in-between began to dissolve, and as she returned to the battlefield, she knew what had to be done. Lyra stood before the rift, her weapon blazing with light as the shadowy creatures swarmed around her. She closed her eyes and reached out with her mind, connecting to the seal and drawing its energy into herself. The darkness fought back, but Lyra held firm, her body glowing with a radiant light that pushed the creatures back. With a final surge of power, Lyra unleashed a wave of energy that tore through the rift, sealing it shut and banishing the creatures back to the void. The battlefield fell silent, the air thick with the remnants of energy and ash. But Lyra knew this was only the beginning. In the days that followed, Lyra and the Guardians prepared for the battles to come. The cycle was nearing its end, but Lyra refused to let humanity face it alone. She carried Kale's legacy with her, a beacon of hope in the face of the encroaching darkness. And somewhere beyond the seal, Kale stood watch, his presence eternal, his mission unending. Together, they would face the cycle's final test and ensure that the light would endure for generations to come.